Hello, and welcome back to Let's Get Lit. In today's episode, we're going to be going over the final two chapters of J.D. Salinger's classic, The Catcher in the Rye. And let's just see how this book ends. Shall we? Alright, let's dive into the last two chapters. Chapter 25 starts out with Holden telling us that he goes outside of Mr. Antolini's apartment and that it was beginning to become light outside. Holden said it was very cold, which felt good because he was sweating so much. He wasn't sure where to go, so he finally ends up going to Grand Central Station where his bags were. He figured he'd sleep there in the waiting room where all the benches are, and that's what he did. He only got to sleep till about 9 o'clock because then a million people started coming in and out and he had to take his feet off the benches. He then begins to think about Mr. Antolini and wonders what he was going to tell Mrs. Antolini when she woke up and saw that Holden wasn't there. Although, he then thinks, I'm not so worried because Mr. Antolini's a good liar and he'll make something up. Holden then begins to think about the night before and if he thought what was happening actually happened, and whether Mr. Antolini was a flit. But at the same time, he wasn't too worried about it because he thinks about all the good things Mr. Antolini has done, from taking him in to making sure he was okay and offering him coffee and cake. Also because he was the first one to go over to James Castle when he jumped out the window. Holden then says he thinks he was catching a cold, but he didn't have a handkerchief on him. It was in his suitcase, but he didn't feel like taking the time to get it out of the box and opening it up in public, etc., etc. He then sees that someone left a magazine near him, so he picks it up and begins to read. This magazine was not very cheerful because it talked about hormones and had pictures of people whose hormones were imbalanced, which kind of looked like how Holden felt. It also went on to talk about how cancer can come in many forms and gave an example of someone who might have cancer. And the example was that if they have wounds that don't heal up quickly enough. Holden remembers that he had a sore in his mouth for about 2 weeks and began to think that he had cancer and that he'll die shortly. Holden then gets it into his head that he needs to have breakfast. So he gets up, goes into the train station, and begins to walk over to the east side of town where there were pretty cheap restaurants. He also didn't want to spend a lot of the money his sister gave him. As he's walking over there, he sees two guys who were unloading a Christmas tree off of a truck. One guy kept screaming to the other to hold the son of a bitch up and hold it thoroughly, and Holden thought this was very funny. And so he begins to laugh. However, as he's laughing, he feels like he's going to start throwing up, so he immediately stops. He then makes it to a little restaurant that sells coffee and donuts, and he orders himself a coffee and a couple donuts. However, he doesn't have the stomach to eat, so he just drinks the coffee. The waitress is nice enough that she takes the donuts back and doesn't charge him for it. When he leaves the restaurant, he walks outside and starts to realize just how Christmassy everything is starting to look, with all of the Santa Clauses standing on the corners, ringing bells for Salvation Army, and this makes him think about the nuns the day before. He thought he might see them, but then realizes no, they're too uptown. He then goes on to talk about how all of the very small children are looking at all the shops with toys in them, and mentions how Phoebe used to like to do this too, but now she just likes to go out and people watch. He then remembers last year when he was Christmas shopping, and how they went to a shoe store and made the salesman put on all different kinds of shoes that were very crazy, only to end up buying a pair of loafers. He said the salesman probably knew what they were doing, but he didn't mind, and he got a good kick out of it. He then continues walking up Fifth Avenue when all of a sudden something spooky starts happening to him. He tells the reader that as he's walking to each end of the block, he imagines that when he steps onto the street, he's going to disappear and not make it to the other side. So he begins to talk to Allie and ask him to keep him safe as he's traveling across the street. And each time he makes it successfully across, he thanks him. He then stops around the 60th Streets and past the zoo. And he sits on a bench. He says he could hardly get his breath and he was still sweating, so he sat for about an hour. As he's sitting there, he gets it into his head that he finally decides what he's going to do. He decided that he's never going to go home again, and that he's not going to another school again, and that he's only going to see Phoebe one more time and say goodbye to her and give her back the Christmas money she had given him. He figures that he'll move out west by hitchhiking, get a job where he fills up people's car with gas and oil, and that's how he'll make his living. And he'll do this pretending to be deaf and mute. Then, with the money that he has, he'll build his own little cabin right at the edge of the woods and get married to a deaf-mute girl as well. All the while pretending he's deaf and mute, so that way he wouldn't have to talk to anyone. And he begins to plan out his little scenario of life. As he finishes thinking about the scenario, he then realizes that the best way to say goodbye to Phoebe would be to go to the school and write her a note, stating to meet him for lunch, which she would have in just a little bit. That way he could say goodbye to her, give the money back, and be on his way. So he rushes across the street to a stationery store, grabs a small notebook and a pencil. However, he's too excited to get to the school to write the note there in the store. So he runs all the way up to the school where she's at, which he also tells the reader is the same school that he went to at her age. He begins to describe the school and that nobody was around, primarily because it wasn't lunchtime or recess yet. He then sees a kid walking across with a bathroom pass in his pocket. He goes over to the stairwell and sits down in the first step and takes out the pad and pencil and begins to write the note. He mentioned that the stairs still had the same smell they used to when he went there, and they smelled like pee. The note he writes said, "Dear Phoebe, I can't wait around till Wednesday anymore, so I'll probably hitchhike out west this afternoon. Meet me at the Museum of Art near the door at 12:15 if you can, and I will give you your Christmas money back because I didn't spend much. Love, Holden." He tells the reader that her school is practically right near the museum and she'd have to pass it anyway on her way home for lunch, so he knew that she could meet him there for a few minutes. He starts walking up the stairs to the principal's office so he could give the note to somebody that would give it to her. He folded it very tightly so they wouldn't open it, and he says you can't trust anybody in schools not to read notes you give them. As he was walking up the stairs though, he all of a sudden thought that he was going to throw up. So he sits down for a second, catches his breath, and begins to feel better. He looks up and sees something that drives him crazy. Somebody had written "fuck you" on the wall. So he immediately begins to clean it up because he doesn't want Phoebe or any of the other kids that age to look at it and wonder what it meant and stress out about it. He says he would like to have caught the person who did it and bashed their heads in until they were dead with blood everywhere. But he knew he wouldn't be able to do that because he was too scared. When he finally gets into the principal's office, he realizes the principal is not there, but his secretary is, and that she looks to be 100 years old. So he tells her that he had a note for Phoebe Caulfield and that he is her brother. He states that her mother is sick and wouldn't have lunch ready in time for Phoebe, and she would have to meet him and have lunch at a drugstore. He says the old lady was nice enough and took the note off of him and gave it to someone else to give to Phoebe. Holden says that then they talked for a little bit, and he told her that he went to Pensy, and she said, "Oh, that's a really nice school." He didn't have the heart to tell her how he actually felt about it, nor the time. As he left, she said goodbye, and this reminded him of when Mr. Spencer did the same thing to him earlier, and it made him feel depressed. On his way out, he went down a different set of staircases and saw another "fuck you" on the wall. This time, however, it was carved in with a knife, so he wasn't able to do anything about it. He said it was hopeless because even if he had a million years to do so, he wouldn't be able to rub out even half of the "fuck yous" in the world. He looks at the clock in the recess yard, and it's about 20 minutes to 12. So he had a little bit of time to kill before he met Phoebe. So he walks to the museum anyway because there wasn't any other place to go. He thought he might stop at the phone booth and give Jane Gallagher a buzz, but he wasn't in the mood. He also says that she wasn't home from vacation yet, so he just went over to the museum and hung around. While he's waiting for Phoebe, two little kids come up to him and ask him if he knew where the mummies were in the exhibit. He mentions that one little kid did all the talking and had his pants unbuttoned. So Holden politely mentions this to him, and the kid buttons his pants up. Holden says he would have laughed out loud, but he would have probably vomited, so he didn't laugh. The kid continues to ask where the mummies are, and Holden says that he's going to horse around with him for just a little bit because he had nothing better to do. After a little bit of horsing around, he asks them, "Don't you have school today?" To which the kid responds, "No, not today." And Holden knew that he was lying through his teeth. But he again decides to horse around with him and asks if the guys were very interested in mummies. To which the one kid who did all the talking responded, and Holden asks the other one, "Hey, your friend ever talk?" And then the little kid who did talk said, "Yeah, that's my brother, and he only talks when he feels like it." He then asks the kid if they know how the Egyptians buried their dead. The kid said no, and Holden said, "Well, you should, because it's really interesting. They wrap their faces in cloth, treated with special chemicals. That way they could be buried in the tombs for thousands of years and their face wouldn't rot." Holden says to get to the mummies, you had to go down this very narrow hallway with stones on either side that they had actually taken right out of the pharaoh's tomb. He said it was pretty spooky, and as he was taking the kids down there, he could tell the two kids weren't enjoying it much. They stuck really close to Holden, and the one who didn't talk was practically holding onto Holden's sleeve. Finally, the scaredy cat couldn't do it anymore and tells his brother that they should leave. The brother who did most of the talking said please forgive him, he has a yellow streak a mile wide, and they both took off. Holden said he was the only one left in the tomb, and he sort of liked it that way because it was nice and peaceful. Then he said on the wall was another "fuck you" written there with red crayon, or something right under the glass. He said he wouldn't be surprised if when they stuck him in a grave when he died, that his tombstone would say Holden Caulfield, date of birth, date of death, and underneath it written "fuck you." After he got out of the mummy exhibit, he then had to go to the bathroom because he had diarrhea. He said he didn't mind the diarrhea so much, but after that he passed out and hit the floor. Luckily, he only landed on his arm, and that's the only thing that really hurt on the way down. He said the funny thing was that he felt better after he passed out, and he didn't feel so dizzy anymore. Then he looks at the clock and realizes it's about 12:10, so he goes back to standing by the door waiting for Phoebe. He thinks about how this might be the last time he'll probably ever see her again, or at least for years. Then he goes on to tell the reader that he might come back when he's like 35 and has this whole scenario planned out in his head. He'll come back, see the family before some of them die, and casually go back to where he's living out west. He mentions how he would be able to come visit on Christmas break, Easter break, or something like that. And DB could come visit him as well. But if DB came to visit, he wouldn't be allowed to write movie scripts, only books and short stories. So he then checks the clock in the coat room 25 after. And he begins to get scared that the old lady in the school didn't give Phoebe the message. And he really wants to make sure that he sees her so he can say goodbye and give her the money. Finally, he sees her through the glass, and he notices she has a big suitcase with her. He then rushes out the door to go down and greet her. When he sees her, he says he thought that she wasn't going to come, and what's with the large bag? He said he didn't need anything, and that he was just going the way he is. And he's not even taking any bags that he has at the station. That's when she tells him that the bag is hers and full of her clothing, and that she's going with him. And then she asks if she can go with him. Holden is stunned by this, but she keeps insisting that she wants to go with him, but he tells her to shut up. She then asks why she can't go, and she said, "Can I please go? I won't even take my clothes if you don't want me to." Through this conversation, Holden is a little bit upset because he doesn't want his sister to go with him, and he starts to get sad. He takes her bag, goes into the museum, and puts it in the check room because he knew that she had to sneak it out of the school, and there was no way she was going to get it back in after lunch. And he knew that the check room, she would be able to pick it up after class. As he's doing this, she begins to cry. He said, "I thought you were supposed to be in a play at school, and I thought you were supposed to be the main star." He asks her, "Do you not want to be in the play anymore?" And this makes her cry even harder. She still continues to cry, and he asks her to stop. He then offers to walk her back to school because she'll be late, but she doesn't answer him. He even tries to hold her hand, but she makes sure that she doesn't let Holden get it. He then asks her if she had lunch, and again, she still won't answer him. Finally, she tells him she's not going back to school, and he didn't know what to say. Then they just kind of stood there for a few minutes and tells her, "You have to go back to school." She then responds, "No," and he says, "Come on, let's go back." Then he tells her that he's not actually going to go anywhere, and that he's going to go home as soon as she goes back to school. He'll go get his bags from the station, and then he'll go straight home. Phoebe insists, though, that she's not going back to school. Then Holden tells her, "What if we go for a walk instead? What if we go for a walk and she can skip the rest of the afternoon?" He asks her, "If I take you out of school for the afternoon, will you go back the next day until Christmas vacation?" She says, "I may, or I may not," and begins to run across the street without even looking to see where the cars are coming from. Holden says that he doesn't try to go after her, and in fact, he knew that she would follow him. So he begins to walk downtown towards the zoo on the park side of the street. And he says she starts walking downtown the same way, but on the other side. But she also wouldn't look at him. However, he knew she was still watching him out of the corner of her eye, just to see where he was going. As they were walking to the zoo, a double-decker bus came along and he couldn't see across the street. But when they got to the zoo, he yelled over at Phoebe, "I'm going to the zoo, come on now." He then turns around and she follows him into the zoo. Holden says there weren't too many people at the zoo, and they're making their way past the many different exhibits. When they got to the sea lions, Phoebe stops and watches the man feed them. Holden tries to go up behind her and tries to hug her, but she bends her knees and she slides out from him. Next, they go to the bear exhibit, and the only bear that was out was the polar bear. The other one was hibernating inside of the cave. While they were standing there watching the bears, a younger son and his dad were there, and the son asks his dad if he can get the other bear to come out. Holden looks over at Phoebe and tries not to laugh, but she's stone cold emotionless. After this, they decide to leave the zoo and go to the park. This time, she was walking a little closer to him. He said that they went down one of the small streets into the park and went through one of those little tunnels, and it always smelled of pee. He said it was on the way to the carousel and that Phoebe wouldn't talk to him, but she was walking right next to him now. And he tries to hold her from the back of the coat, but she tells him, "Keep your hands off of me." As they get to the park, they can hear the carousel, and Holden mentions the same music the carousel was playing then also was the same music that played when he was a kid. He mentions at least that was one nice thing about carousels. They always play the same music. Phoebe tells Holden, shouldn't the carousel be closed because of the wintertime? To which Holden says, it's around Christmas, so they probably open it up for that reason. He then asks her if she wants to go on a ride, and he knew she probably would, because Phoebe loved riding the carousels when she was littler. Also, DB and Allie and Holden would take her to the park when she was little, and she would love to go on it. He goes and buys her a ticket, and they stand outside until the carousel stops. As he hands over the ticket, he also hands her the wad of money and tells her to keep it. But then she asks for him to keep it, and she even adds please. So he puts the money back in his pocket, and she asks him if he's going to ride as well. And he said, maybe I will, but next time. This time, he just wants to watch her go on it. He goes over to a nearby bench by the carousel and watches as she gets on and chooses an old beat-up brown horse to sit on. He mentions the song that was playing was Smoke Get In Your Eyes, and it had a very fun, jazzy feel to it. He said that as the carousel was going around, all of the kids were trying to grab a golden ring that was on the edges, and he worried she might have fallen off. However, he tells the reader that nothing is worse in the world than to tell a little kid not to go for the ring and them hurt themselves, than for them to just try for it and hurt themselves in the first place. After the ride was finished, she then gets off and she asks if he'll ride with him too. He said no, he'll just watch, and he gave her some money to get more tickets. She then tells him that she's not mad at him anymore, and he says, I know, now hurry up before it starts again. Then she gives him a little kiss and she held up her hands and she said, it's raining, and it starts to rain. Holden says, I know, and then he says that she reaches into her pocket, pulls out the hunting cap, and puts it on Holden's head. He asks her, don't you want it? And she says, you can wear it for a while. Holden says, okay, but hurry up, you're gonna miss your ride. If you miss your ride, you won't get your horse. But she kept hanging around. She asked him if he meant what he said and that he really wasn't going to go anywhere, and if he was going to go home straight after. Holden says yes, and he tells her that he wasn't lying, and he really was going to go home afterwards. He then tells her to hurry up again, and she runs, buys her tickets, and gets back on the same old horse. And she waves to him, and he waves back to her. He says that it began to rain like a bastard in buckets. And he mentions how all the parents and mothers and everybody goes to stand under the roof of the carousel so they don't get soaking wet. But he stuck around on the bench for a little bit longer. He said he got pretty soaking wet, especially his neck and his pants, but his hunting hat gave him a lot of protection. He didn't care about this, and he actually felt really happy all of a sudden, the way old Phoebe was going around and around. It made him almost begin to cry because he felt very happy. He didn't know why. He just knew that she looked so damn nice, and she kept going around and around in her little blue coat. He tells the reader that he wishes we could see it. This is where chapter 25 ends. Now, let's jump to the very short ending of this book. Chapter 26 starts out with Holden telling the reader that's pretty much all he's going to talk about. He says that he could have talked about how he went home afterwards, got sick, and that he was going to go to school the next fall after he gets out of here. But he doesn't feel like it. He said that stuff really doesn't interest him that much at the moment. He said a lot of people here, especially the psychoanalyst guy, they keep asking Holden if he's going to apply himself when he gets back to school in September. He says it's a stupid question in his opinion because he doesn't know. He said, how am I supposed to know until you're already doing it? He said he thinks that he is, but he's not sure. He says that DB isn't as bad as the rest of them, but he keeps asking him a lot of questions. He also drove over last Saturday with his new English girlfriend that's starring in one of the movies he's writing. Holden says she's pretty affected, but really good looking. He says that when she went to the bathroom, DB asks him what he thought of her and about all the stuff he's just finished telling us. He didn't really know what to say, if you want to know the truth, but he didn't know what to think about it. He says he's sorry. He's told so many people about what's going on. He says he sort of misses everybody he's told about, even old Stradlater and Ackley, and even Maurice. Holden ends by saying, you know, it's funny. Don't ever tell anybody anything, because if you do, you start missing everybody. This is where J.D. Salinger's classic, The Catcher in the Rye, ends. I hope you enjoyed this series as we went through one of the most controversial classics. Please let me know down below what you think of it and if you've read the book or not. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, stay lit.